It was late October when I first came across the Labubu doll. I was scrolling through an online auction site, half-heartedly looking for a Halloween decoration that wasn't one of the same cheap plastic things everyone seemed to own. That's when I saw it. A small, plush doll, about a foot tall, with oversized button eyes and a permanently stitched smile. Its tag read Labubu, and the seller claimed it was a rare vintage toy from the early 2000s. Something about it seemed off, yet I felt drawn to it, as if it were calling my name. Against my better judgment, I bought it. When it arrived a few days later, it came in a plain cardboard box with no extra packaging, just the doll staring up at me with its crooked smile. I shrugged and placed it on a shelf in my bedroom. At first, it was just another decoration, something to glance at without much thought. But that night, I noticed something strange. The doll seemed to have moved slightly. I live alone in a small apartment in Pennsylvania, so the thought of someone breaking in made my heart race. But all doors and windows were locked, and nothing was disturbed. I chalked it up to my imagination and went to sleep. The next morning, I found it sitting on my desk, facing me, even though I had left it on the shelf. My pulse quickened, but I told myself I must have moved it in my sleep or simply remembered placing it somewhere else. I laughed nervously and set it back on the shelf, telling myself to stop being paranoid. I had no reason to think a doll could move on its own, or did I? Over the following days, small things began to happen. The doll would appear in different places around my apartment, on the couch, on the kitchen counter, even once on the bathroom sink while I brushed my teeth. At first, I thought it was a prank. Maybe someone had found my address through the auction site and was messing with me. But my apartment building was nearly empty, and I had no visitors. The idea that someone was sneaking in was terrifying, but improbable. I started setting up my phone camera overnight, hoping to catch some evidence. When I reviewed the footage, my stomach dropped. There was nothing, until about 3 nights in, when the camera clearly captured the doll shifting positions while I slept. Its head tilted slowly toward the lens, and its button eyes seemed to glint in the dark. My hands shook as I paused the video frame. It was impossible. It was just a doll, and yet the footage proved otherwise. I didn't sleep well that night. Things escalated quickly after that. I began noticing faint whispers when I was alone, soft and indistinct, like someone murmuring just out of reach. Sometimes I would wake up to the sound of tiny footsteps pacing my apartment. My friends and family dismissed my concerns when I called them, chalking it up to stress or imagination. But I knew it wasn't. I started leaving small objects near the doll: pens, paper, coins. The next morning they would be moved, sometimes stacked, sometimes spread across the floor in patterns I couldn't comprehend. It was as if the doll was alive, communicating in some language I couldn't decipher. One evening, I came home to find the doll sitting in my armchair, surrounded by all the objects I had ever left near it. The most disturbing part was the paper. Scrawled on it, in what looked like frantic handwriting, were phrases like, "I see you," and "Don't sleep." My heart raced, and I realized this was no longer a prank or a quirk of the mind. It wanted something from me, something I didn't understand. The intensity increased over the next week. I began hearing my name whispered even when the apartment was completely silent. Lights flickered when the doll was nearby, and I started having vivid nightmares about it. In my dreams, the doll would crawl across the room toward me, its stitched smile widening into something grotesque, and I would wake up drenched in sweat, the doll closer than it had been when I fell asleep. One night, I even woke to find it perched on my chest, just staring at me, its button eyes reflecting the dim light of my alarm clock. Desperate for answers, I dug into the doll's history. The seller had disappeared, and online forums mentioned Labubu dolls, but only in hushed tones, usually alongside warnings about haunted toys and cursed objects. One post stood out. A woman claimed she had bought a Labubu doll for her child, only for it to terrorize the household for months until she burned it. Others mentioned similar patterns: dolls moving on their own, strange noises, nightmares, even injuries inflicted by invisible forces. Some called it a malevolent spirit trapped within the fabric. The thought made me nauseous, but I knew I couldn't keep it any longer. I decided to leave the apartment for a night, thinking maybe distance would give me a break. I stayed at a friend's place, but I couldn't relax. Every few minutes, my phone would buzz. Messages I hadn't typed appeared. A single word on each screen, sometimes here, sometimes watching, sometimes closer. My blood ran cold. The doll wasn't just in my apartment, it was reaching me, no matter where I went. I turned off my phone and tried to sleep, but I dreamt of it climbing through the streets, its smile growing with every step. By now, I was terrified to touch it. Every time I approached it, I felt a crushing weight in my chest, like the air itself had thickened. Friends tried to help, offering to take it away or perform some kind of cleansing, but nothing worked. Even when it was boxed or hidden, it would find its way back, always facing me, always smiling. I began to fear for my sanity. Was I imagining things? No. The scratches on my arms, the whispered words, the objects moved overnight, they were real. One night, I awoke to the sound of laughter. It was low and gurgling, not human, echoing in the corners of my apartment. I froze. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and there it was, on the ceiling, hanging by a cord from the smoke detector, its button eyes glinting, stitched mouth stretched unnaturally wide. I couldn't breathe. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it at the doll, and in that moment, I swore its eyes blinked. I dropped the flashlight, it clattered across the floor, and when I looked up again, the doll was gone. The laughter continued, fading into silence. I didn't sleep for 3 nights after that. I left all the lights on and sat in the living room with a baseball bat, ready to defend myself. Every shadow felt like it was moving, every creak of the building like footsteps. Then, one night, I woke up not in my bed but on the floor, the doll hovering inches above me. Its smile was different now, twisted, almost malicious. It whispered my name, softly at first, then louder, until it seemed to echo in my head. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. The doll leaned closer, and I saw the faintest shimmer of something behind its button eyes, like black smoke writhing beneath the surface. I passed out. I awoke at dawn, alone. The doll was back on the shelf, perfectly upright, as if nothing had happened. My clothes were torn, and I had bruises forming along my arms and legs. I took it outside, thinking maybe I could destroy it, but every time I tried to drop it, it would return to my hands. I tried burning it once, thinking fire might end this nightmare. Flames licked its fabric, smoke curling into the room, but by the next morning, the doll sat on my bed, unscathed, smiling that same unyielding grin. I started to cry. There was no escaping it. Weeks passed. I stopped leaving my apartment. I stopped answering calls. I barely ate. The doll became my constant companion, always watching, always whispering. I tried talking to it, reasoning with it, begging it to leave me alone. Sometimes I thought I saw it tilt its head, almost listening. But I never received an answer I could understand. I was trapped in a reality where one small toy held all the power, where my life had become a constant negotiation with something that shouldn't exist. One night, I had an idea. Maybe if I acknowledged it fully, embraced it as real, I could gain some control. I placed it on the floor, kneeling before it, hands pressed together like a prayer. I whispered, "I see you. I know you're real. I'm not afraid." For the first time, silence filled the apartment. The air felt heavy but not suffocating. The doll sat motionless. I dared to sleep dream. The next morning, the doll was gone. I searched every inch of the apartment, even outside, but it had vanished. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with fear. I knew it hadn't left for good. I knew it was waiting, watching, planning. The memory of its gaze, the feeling of its presence in the darkness, lingered like a scar. Months later, I moved to another state, thinking distance might sever whatever bond had formed. I unpacked slowly, arranging my new apartment cautiously. That's when I saw it, a small box on my doorstep. No return address. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was the Labubu doll, smiling, waiting. Its button eyes seemed to glimmer in the late afternoon sun. And then I heard it, softly in my mind, home. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I knew better. I only stared. The doll had returned, and I understood in a terrifying clarity that it was not just a toy. It was something ancient, something patient, something that thrived on fear and attention. It would never leave me. Every attempt to ignore it, to discard it, or destroy it had failed. It existed in a space I couldn't reach, yet somehow it was always there, watching, smiling, waiting. And I realized that this was my life now, tethered to a small plush figure whose stitched smile hid a malevolence I couldn't begin to fight. I have friends now, new people in my life, but I never tell them about the doll. I can't. Even saying its name aloud seems dangerous. Sometimes, late at night, I feel a small weight on my chest, or hear a soft giggle in the dark. And when I glance at the shelf, or even out of the corner of my eye, I see it, sitting there, smiling, perfectly still, waiting for me to acknowledge it again. I don't know if it feeds on fear or despair, or if it simply enjoys the game of knowing it has power over me. But I know one thing for certain: it will never stop. I will never be free. It is patient, and I am bound to it, willingly or not, for the rest of my life. The Labubu doll is not a toy. It is something more, something that watches, something that waits. And somewhere deep inside me, I know that it is always smiling, always patient, always thinking about the moment when I will finally lose all control. Every shadow, every creak of the floor, every whisper in the dead of night reminds me it is here. It is real, and it is never leaving. Story the end. It started on a rainy evening in a small town in Ohio. I had just moved into an old Victorian-style house, one of those creaky, drafty homes that look picturesque in the daylight, but hold an eerie stillness at night. While unpacking boxes in the attic, I found a small, dusty package that had been hidden behind the rafters. Inside was a Labubu doll, its tiny body made of worn velvet, and its face stitched into a perpetual grin. Its button eyes were mismatched, then one brown and one black, giving it an unsettling expression that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had never seen anything like it before. Something about it seemed alive. I placed it on a shelf in the living room, thinking it would make a quirky decoration. That night, I noticed a strange sensation of being watched. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks in the dark corners of the old house. But over the next few nights, small things began to happen. The doll would appear in different locations, on the kitchen table, on my bed, even once sitting on the toilet. I would swear I hadn't moved it. I asked a neighbor if anyone had been inside my house, and they assured me no one had. Then came the sounds. At first, it was faint scratching, almost like fingernails on wood. Later, I began hearing whispering, soft and almost indecipherable. It would start whenever I was alone, growing louder as the night went on. I recorded the noises, but playback revealed nothing but static. I started sleeping with all the lights on, but even then, I felt the doll's gaze upon me. It was always facing me no matter where I moved it. If I turned it around, the next day it would be back, facing me again. One morning, I awoke to find a note pinned to the doll with a tiny, rusty safety pin. Written in a shaky, almost childlike scrawl were the words, "Don't sleep." My heart raced. I was living alone. There was no one in the house but me. I shoved the doll into a box and tried to put it in the garage, but the next morning it was back on my shelf, smiling at me as if mocking my attempt to hide it. I began to notice other changes. Objects in the house would move without explanation. Doors would open and slam shut. Lights flickered. And sometimes I could swear I saw shadows that didn't belong to anything. The air in the house felt heavy, almost suffocating, and a cold draft would linger around the doll no matter how much I tried to heat the house. I started keeping a journal, writing down every strange occurrence, but the more I wrote, the worse it got. The doll seemed to react to my fear, its grin widening, its button eyes seeming to glimmer with malice. One night, I awoke to the sound of giggling. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and saw the doll sitting on the edge of my dresser. Its head slowly turned toward me. I could feel a presence pressing into my chest, making it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The doll tilted its head, and in the dim light, I swear its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Stay with me." I blacked out. When I came to, it was morning, and the doll was back on the shelf. Bruises had formed on my arms, small scratches across my face, as if it had touched me while I slept. I started to research Labubu dolls, desperate to find someone who could explain what was happening. Online, I found forum posts from people who had similar experiences. Each story was chillingly alike. The dolls moved on their own, whispered to their owners, and caused physical and psychological distress. Some reported injuries, others reported long-term hauntings that never ended. One person even claimed their Labubu doll had caused the death of a family member. The stories were terrifying, but they confirmed what I had begun to accept. This was no ordinary toy. I tried to get rid of it. I left it on the curb, hoping someone would take it, but when I returned the next day, it was sitting on my porch, perfectly clean, staring at me. I tried to burn it, submerge it in water, even wrap it in heavy chains, but nothing worked. The doll always returned, smiling, waiting. I could no longer leave the house. I could no longer trust my own mind. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified. It was relentless. Weeks turned into months. My life shrank to the size of that small house, dominated by the presence of the doll. I began talking to it, reasoning, begging, apologizing. Sometimes it would move slightly, tilt its head, or shift its gaze, and I thought maybe it understood me. But the relief was fleeting. At night, I would wake to the feeling of being watched, the faint giggle, the whispers that seemed to echo inside my own head. One particularly cold night, I woke up to see the doll standing at the foot of my bed. Its button eyes were glinting, and its stitched mouth seemed wider than ever, almost stretching impossibly across its face. My body felt frozen, as if some invisible weight pinned me in place. It began to slowly crawl toward me, moving unnaturally fast for something so small. I tried to scream. My voice failed. I could feel the air thickening around me, pressing down, making each breath a struggle. The doll stopped inches from my face, and I could hear a faint whisper, "Forever." It touched my hand, and I blacked out. When I woke, it was morning, and I was lying on the floor. The doll sat on my chest, perfectly still, staring at me. Bruises and scratches had appeared again, fresh and raw. I realized with sinking dread that it didn't just move. It didn't just whisper. It had power, real, terrifying power. And it was patient. It would wait, bide its time, and torment me whenever it wanted. I was no longer the master of my life. The doll was. I moved, thinking distance might help. I left Ohio, drove across 3 states, and rented a small apartment in a quiet town in New Jersey. I thought I could start over. I unpacked cautiously, keeping the doll hidden in a box. But within days, I began to notice small changes. Items would disappear from the box, the air would grow cold, and at night, I would hear tiny, deliberate footsteps across the apartment floor. One evening, I found the box open and the doll sitting on my bed. Its smile was impossibly wide, its button eyes glinting with a malevolent intelligence. I knew then that no matter where I went, no matter what I did, it would follow. The Labubu doll is not a toy. It is a presence, patient, intelligent, and malevolent. It thrives on fear, feeding off my anxiety, my despair. Every sound in the night, every shadow in the corner of my eye is a reminder that it is always there, watching. And even now, as I write this, it sits on the shelf beside me, its gaze fixed, its stitched smile unchanging. I know I cannot escape. I know it will never leave me. I am bound to it, and every day that passes, I feel its influence growing stronger. There is no safe place, no distance, no object that can end its watchful presence. It waits. It smiles. And it will always be here, just beyond the edge of reason, reminding me that I am never alone. Story the end. I remember the day I found it like it was yesterday, though the memory still sends chills down my spine. I had just graduated from college in New England and decided to move to a small town in Pennsylvania to start a new life, working remotely for a marketing company. The apartment I found was old but charming. Creaky floors, tall ceilings, and windows that let in more sunlight than I was used to. Everything about it felt peaceful, until I found the Labubu doll. It started at a local flea market. I wandered through aisles of faded furniture, glassware, and miscellaneous antiques when a small figure caught my eye. It was a wooden doll, roughly carved, painted in dull reds and greens. Its eyes were glassy, almost too real for something so small, and its painted smile looked wrong, almost predatory. The old vendor noticed me staring. "Ah, you've got an eye for labubas," he said. "They come from Indonesia, rare little things. People say they protect the house or sometimes bring a little chaos." He grinned faintly. "They like attention, treat them kindly, and they stay quiet. Ignore them, and, well, let's just say they get creative." I laughed nervously, but there was something in his tone that made me hesitate. I decided to buy it anyway, charmed by its strangeness. $50 later, it was mine. I placed it on a small wooden shelf near the kitchen window, figuring it would at least look decorative. The first night, I didn't notice anything unusual, but on the second night, I woke to a faint scratching sound. It was soft, almost imperceptible, coming from the living room. I got up, thinking it was the wind rattling the windows. But when I switched on the light, The doll was on the floor in front of the shelf. I hadn't moved it. I laughed nervously, convinced I was imagining things, and put it back. I went back to bed trying to ignore the unease curling in my stomach. That night, I dreamt of the doll. Its eyes glimmered in the dark, and it whispered my name over and over. I woke up sweating and shaking, but the doll was back on the shelf, innocent and still, or so it seemed. Over the next week, strange things started happening. Objects in the apartment moved, sometimes disappearing entirely, only to show up in odd places. A mug in the freezer, my keys inside a lampshade, my shoes lined up neatly in front of the shelf. The doll's presence seemed to amplify the disturbances. I started noticing a faint, sweet smell, like incense or herbs, that followed the doll wherever it was placed. One evening, as I was working late on my laptop, I glanced at the doll and froze. Its head was turned slightly toward me. I hadn't moved it. The painted smile seemed wider than before, as if it was mocking me. A cold sweat ran down my back. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Nighttime became unbearable. The scratching returned, louder, accompanied by whispering that seemed to come from the doll itself. Look. See. Stay. It said softly, indistinct at first, then clear enough to make my blood run cold. I tried talking to it, reasoning, pleading, even threatening. Sometimes it seemed to respond, shifting slightly when I spoke. Sometimes it remained still, but I could feel a pressure in the room, like a heavy presence, watching and waiting. The events escalated quickly. I woke one night to find the doll sitting on my chest, staring at me. Its eyes were no longer just glass. They were liquid black, swirling slowly, alive. I could feel it pressing down, controlling me in some way I couldn't comprehend. I panicked, throwing it across the room, but when I looked again, it was back on the shelf, smiling that impossibly wide smile. I reached out to a paranormal group online, hoping for advice. They warned me that Labubu dolls attach themselves to a person, feeding on fear and isolation. Ignoring them or trying to remove them without proper ritual only strengthens them. I tried everything: burning sage, encasing it in a box, taking it outside to bury it. Each time it returned, sometimes in a new, more disturbing position, facing me on my bed on the kitchen counter. One night, I had friends over, hoping to prove I wasn't losing my mind. That night, the doll moved on its own in front of them. Chairs slid across the floor, a lamp tipped over, and a low humming filled the room. The dolls, because suddenly there were more, appeared. Tiny figurines, similar in style, filled the apartment. I panicked, trying to collect them, but they multiplied, their eyes black, their smiles unnerving. My friends screamed and left, leaving me alone. Months passed, and I barely left my apartment. My work suffered. My social life disappeared. The doll, or dolls controlled my every moment. I could feel them whispering constantly, especially at night. Sometimes I woke to scratches on my arms, arranged in patterns that seemed intentional. Other times, objects would be lined up neatly around the dolls, like offerings. The final night was the worst. I awoke to dozens of dolls surrounding my bed, all staring at me, whispering in a chorus I could barely comprehend. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. They moved closer, small wooden arms reaching toward me, smiles stretching impossibly wide. I blacked out. I woke up in the hospital. The apartment had been cleared out, my landlord said, but no one believed me. I moved to another state, hoping distance would help, but sometimes when it's quiet, I hear it. My name, softly spoken, carried on a wind that isn't there. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I see movement that shouldn't be possible. I know it's still out there, still watching, still waiting. Story the end. It started in the middle of a cold January night. I was living alone in a small townhouse in Pennsylvania after moving away from my family for work. My best friend Lisa had called earlier that evening, asking if I wanted to come over for a late-night movie marathon. I was tired from unpacking, so I declined, thinking I'd just stay home and relax. Around 11:30 p.m., I heard a soft knock at my front door. I frowned. It was unusual for anyone to be out that late in my quiet neighborhood. I opened the door and found a small package on the porch. No note, no indication of who sent it. Curiosity got the better of me. I carried it inside and unwrapped it. Inside was a doll, no taller than a foot, with an unnervingly pale face, round black eyes that seemed too deep to be human, and a faint, eerie smile. Its outfit was simple, a tattered red dress that looked like it belonged to another era. At first, I thought it was just some prank. Maybe Lisa had sent it without telling me. But when I called her, she sounded confused and genuinely alarmed. "I didn't send any doll," she said. "Are you sure it wasn't left by a neighbor or a delivery mistake?" I shrugged, placing it on my kitchen counter. But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint creaks from the living room. When I got up to check, the doll was sitting on the couch, facing me. I hadn't moved it. My heart raced. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Doors that I had locked were suddenly open. Objects would be slightly out of place, even though I was careful to put everything back. Most unsettling, though, were the sounds at night. Footsteps on the stairs, soft giggles that seemed to come from empty rooms, and whispers that were almost impossible to make out, calling my name. I tried to get rid of the doll. I put it in a box and stored it in the garage. But the next morning it was back on my kitchen table. I burned it once, leaving it in the fireplace for hours, but the next day it was in my bedroom, perched at the foot of my bed. The fear became unbearable. I confided in Lisa again, who suggested calling a paranormal investigator she knew. When he came, he examined the doll and the house. He noted the intensity of negative energy in the home and warned that the doll wasn't just haunted. It seemed sentient, able to interact with its surroundings and possibly feeding on fear. One night around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of whispering directly in my ear. I froze, but the words were indistinct. When I turned on the lamp, the doll was on my nightstand, staring at me. Its black eyes glinted unnaturally. I reached to pick it up, and it moved back, just out of my reach, as if aware of my touch. Things escalated. The doll would appear in different rooms, always in positions that seemed deliberate, sitting on chairs, leaning over counters, standing in hallways. It would watch me, and sometimes I would wake to find it closer than before. I began seeing it in my peripheral vision, sometimes reflected in mirrors, always smiling, always watching. One evening, I tried to confront it. I spoke aloud, demanding it leave me alone, that I did not want it in my life. For a moment, the room fell silent. Then the lights flickered, the floorboards creaked, and I heard a voice, a high, soft voice, whispering from the corner of the room, "You can't leave. Not yet." I panicked, grabbing a kitchen knife. I lunged at the doll, but it passed through as if it were a shadow. I backed away, gasping. That's when I noticed faint movement around the edges of the room. Shadows twisting unnaturally, objects floating slightly off the ground. It wasn't just the doll, something else was present, something dark. I called Lisa, trembling. She told me about similar experiences her cousin had encountered years before with what he called Labubu, a doll that appeared to be sentient and malevolent. He warned her that once a doll like that chose a target, it never truly leaves. Days turned into weeks. I barely slept, living in constant fear. The doll would sit in a corner during the day, but at night it roamed freely. Sometimes I would wake to it sitting on my chest, staring into my eyes, whispering promises I didn't understand. I tried to ignore it, but ignoring it seemed to make it stronger, bolder. I moved to a new apartment, thinking I could escape. But within days, it appeared in the corner of my bedroom, unboxed, uninvited. No matter how far I went, it followed. I covered windows, locked doors, even tried exorcisms, but nothing worked. The investigator told me there was no known method to destroy it permanently. The only option was to coexist, to accept its presence without showing fear. Acceptance didn't make it easier. Some nights I would wake to find it perched on my dresser, its black eyes glowing faintly. It never harmed me physically, but the psychological toll was immense. I felt watched constantly, even when I left the apartment. Shadows seemed to cling to me in ways that felt unnatural, and sometimes I could swear I heard it giggling behind me in empty streets. I began to notice patterns. The doll seemed to appear more actively when I was alone, when I felt most vulnerable. Sometimes it would whisper suggestions, hints of danger, urging me toward panic or despair. The longer I looked into its eyes, the more I felt my own memories blur, moments of time slipping away, leaving a hollow emptiness in their place. Years passed. I stopped calling friends or family about it. I stopped leaving my apartment whenever possible. Grocery trips became rare, and I relied on deliveries, though sometimes I would find the doll sitting in plain view when the delivery arrived, smiling in that same unchanging way. I realized it had become a permanent part of my life, a silent observer that tolerated me as long as I respected its presence. Fear, I learned, made it strong. Calmness made it patient. Over time, I trained myself to live with it, to move carefully, to never provoke it. Yet the knowledge that it could act at any moment remained, a constant pressure. Sometimes at night, I still hear whispers. Sometimes I feel a chill as if its tiny hand brushes against mine while I sleep. I know it waits for the moment when I falter, when I show weakness. And when that happens, I have no doubt it will act. I often see news stories online. Strange occurrences, unexplained phenomena, haunted dolls appearing on doorsteps. Occasionally, one matches the description perfectly. Small, pale face, black eyes, tattered clothing. And I know that Labubu doesn't just exist in one place. It moves, it finds new targets, it feeds on the fear it generates. I've lived with it so long that I can almost predict its movements. I keep my apartment meticulously tidy, my steps careful and deliberate. But I know deep down it is always learning, always watching, and one day it will test me. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I sense a presence in the corner of my room. Its eyes are hidden in shadow, but I feel them burning into me. The air is cold, heavier than it should be, and somewhere a soft, almost inaudible giggle drifts through the silence. I don't know how long I can last like this. I don't know if there's any escape. I only know that Labubu is patient, eternal, and relentless. And when it finally decides to act, there will be nothing left but the terror of knowing you cannot hide, you cannot fight, and you cannot survive its gaze. Story the end. It started on a gray November afternoon when my friend Jenna called me, her voice tight and nervous. She had just moved into a small apartment in the outskirts of Detroit, a cheap place near the old railway tracks. The building was worn, peeling paint and creaky floors, but she was excited to live on her own for the first time. When I arrived to help her unpack, the first thing that caught my eye was a small doll sitting in a cardboard box she'd found in the closet. It was a Labubu doll, no bigger than a toddler, with wide, black, button-like eyes, chubby limbs, and a permanent smile. Its hands were slightly outstretched, and its head tilted as though it was curious about the world. Jenna laughed when I asked about it. "I found it behind the closet panel," she said. "It was like someone hid it there. It's creepy, but cute, right?" I nodded, but I couldn't shake the chill I felt looking at it. That night, she placed the doll on a small shelf by her bed. I left, telling her I had an early class the next morning, but I remember glancing back at the doll. Its eyes seemed unusually dark, almost wet, and for a second I could have sworn it moved slightly, just the tiniest tilt of the head. The first incident came a few days later. Jenna called me around midnight, panicked. She said she had gone to the kitchen to get water, and when she returned, the doll was sitting on her bed, though she had left it on the shelf. I tried to calm her, suggesting she must have sleepwalked or moved it herself, but her voice shook, and I believed her. She swore she hadn't touched it. After that, the events escalated. At first, it was subtle. Objects slightly out of place, shadows in corners that disappeared when she looked directly at them, faint scratching noises behind the walls. But soon it became physical. One morning, Jenna woke to find deep scratches on her bedroom door, vertical and jagged, and the doll sitting in front of them, head tilted, as if satisfied. I began spending nights at her apartment to see if anything would happen while I was there. The first night was quiet, but the second night, around 2 a.m., the whispers began. Faint at first, like the wind, but then distinct. I could hear soft, childlike voices murmuring my name, though Jenna was asleep beside me. I turned to look at the doll. Its head had shifted, its eyes now reflecting the moonlight that spilled through the window. The air grew cold, and the room seemed to stretch, longer and darker than it should have been. I could feel a presence pressing against my chest, heavy and unyielding. Jenna's mental state began deteriorating rapidly. She started writing in a journal about every incident, the doll moving, whispers, shadows, objects being rearranged. She spoke of seeing shapes behind the doll, dark forms that flickered in and out of sight. Friends visiting her apartment reported unease, headaches, and sudden coldness that had no source. One friend even said the doll's eyes seemed to follow her from every angle. The most disturbing incident occurred one rainy evening. Jenna had gone out to grab groceries. I stayed behind, alone, unsure if I wanted to be there, but I felt compelled to help. Around 11 p.m., the lights began flickering violently. The whispers started again, louder, urgent. The doll was no longer on the shelf. It sat at the edge of the room, on the floor, facing me, its head tilted unnaturally, almost mechanically, as if it were observing me. I reached for it, intending to move it back to the shelf, but as my fingers touched its arms, a shock went through me, and the room seemed to warp. I stumbled back, and when I looked again, the doll had moved closer, almost crawling, its eyes wide and unblinking. I could hear the whispering clearly now. My name, Jenna's name, fragmented phrases in a language I didn't recognize. Panic overtook me. I grabbed a heavy blanket and wrapped it around the doll, throwing it into the bathtub. The whispers stopped. The room was quiet, but I knew it was temporary. When Jenna returned, I told her what happened. She was terrified, but there was no anger, just fear and resignation. We tried research. Labubu dolls were supposed to be spiritual conduits, vessels for entities that could either protect or harm, depending on how they were treated. Some sources suggested that angering one could lead to illness, accidents, or worse. The thought that this doll had been hidden in the apartment for who knows how long, its spirit dormant and now awakened, was terrifying. We attempted to leave it outside, hoping to get rid of it. But the next morning, it was back on the shelf, head tilted, as if nothing had happened. It became clear that it didn't belong to the apartment. It belonged to us now, a constant presence that demanded attention and respect. The doll's influence continued. Jenna lost hours of time, sometimes waking in strange positions with bruises she didn't remember acquiring. She saw fleeting shapes, almost human but wrong, moving just out of the corner of her eye. One night, she awoke to find it sitting on her chest, staring at her. She screamed, and it disappeared, leaving her shaken and exhausted. I started noticing strange events in my own life, too. Shadows that flickered across walls when no one was there, cold spots that followed me, and dreams where the doll appeared, always whispering, always watching. I realized it wasn't limited to Jenna. It had marked me, tethered us together. Desperate, we sought help from a medium, a woman who had dealt with spirits and cursed objects. She told us the doll was bound to an entity that was neither fully benevolent nor fully malevolent, but that it thrived on fear and attention. We were advised to create a boundary, a circle of salt, offerings of food, and prayers. We tried it, placing the doll in the center of the circle, hoping to contain it. It worked for a while. The air felt less heavy, the whispers receded, but the presence remained, patient and observant. We eventually moved the doll to a remote cabin owned by a family friend in rural Michigan, hoping isolation would diminish its influence. We placed it on a high shelf in an empty room surrounded by protective symbols and offerings. For weeks, we felt a strange relief, as if the tension had eased. But dreams continued. Every night I saw it, crawling, whispering, tilting its head toward me, always waiting. Jenna and I realized then that we had underestimated it. This was not a toy. It wasn't a mere object to be discarded. It was alive in a way that defied reason, tethered to us through fear, obsession, and attention. Moving it didn't change that. It would always be present, patient, watching, whispering. Years later, I still see it in my dreams. I still feel its gaze sometimes, even in crowded rooms. We avoid dolls, antiques, anything that might attract it. We rarely speak of it aloud. The Labubu doll is more than a doll. It is a presence, patient and calculating, and it does not forgive neglect. It watches, waits, and whispers, always reminding us that some things cannot be contained and some things never leave. Story the end. When I was 19, I moved into a small apartment in rural Pennsylvania, a one-bedroom on the second floor of an old building built sometime in the 1950s. The rent was cheap, the location was quiet, and I had just started college, so it seemed perfect. My landlord was a wiry old man named Mr. Callahan, who had a tendency to hand out free stuff from the storage room in the basement. "Take whatever you like," he said the first time I signed the lease. "Just don't let it collect dust down there forever." A week after moving in, I went down to the basement to grab some boxes of books I'd brought. The basement smelled like damp concrete and mothballs, the kind of smell that makes you wrinkle your nose and pull your jacket tighter. Amidst stacks of old furniture and forgotten toys, I noticed a small stuffed doll sitting on a crate. It was tiny, maybe a foot tall, and its fabric was faded yellow and patched in places. Its head was too large for its body, with oversized ears that stuck out awkwardly. Its grin was stitched wide with black thread, and its eyes were round glass that seemed to glimmer even in the dim light. A small, crooked word was embroidered across its chest. Labubu. I laughed quietly to myself, thinking it looked like a homemade Halloween decoration, but I couldn't shake the way it seemed to stare directly at me. On impulse, I grabbed it and carried it upstairs. Mr. Callahan had been right. There was no one else in the basement, and the doll seemed lonely enough to join me. I set it on a shelf in the corner of my living room, thinking it might add a bit of character to the drab apartment. The first few nights were normal, but soon strange things began happening. I'd wake up to the sound of soft scratching like nails on wood. My books would be pulled off shelves, or the kitchen chairs slightly shifted from where I had left them. Most unnerving was the feeling that someone or something was watching me. My friends joked about me being paranoid, that living alone was getting to me, but the doll's presence made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. One night, I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of whispering. It was low, unintelligible, almost like a murmur just beyond comprehension. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint shadow moving across the floor. I froze, straining to see, and that's when I noticed the doll was no longer on its shelf. Instead, it was at the foot of my bed, sitting upright, its tiny head tilted as if studying me. I swear its stitched grin had stretched wider, and the glass eyes seemed to catch the faint light of the street lamp outside, glimmering in a way that made my skin crawl. I picked it up quickly, my hands trembling, and shoved it back onto the shelf. I tried to tell myself I had placed it near the bed before falling asleep, but I had no memory of doing so. I wrapped myself in my blankets and waited for the sunrise, but sleep never came. Over the next few days, the doll's behavior escalated. I would leave the apartment for errands, and when I returned, I'd find it in a different position, sitting on the kitchen counter, lying across my textbooks, or once leaning against my front door, staring out the peephole. It was never damaged, never dirty, just present, always watching. I started moving it back to its original shelf multiple times a day, but it kept appearing elsewhere, always with that same unnerving grin. Then the noises began. Late at night, I would hear soft footsteps pacing across the living room. Sometimes I would hear faint giggling, barely audible, echoing through the apartment. My phone would ring in the middle of the night, but there was never anyone on the line. One evening, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror across the hallway. When I turned, the doll was standing on the floor, closer than it had ever been, its head cocked to the side. I called Mr. Callahan, desperate to find out if the doll had a history. He paused for a long time, then muttered something under his breath. Labubu. I shouldn't have let that go. I pressed him for details, but he was cagey, only admitting that the doll had come from an estate sale years ago. He claimed it had belonged to a little girl who had died under tragic circumstances, and her family swore the doll was cursed. I didn't ask further. I just hung up, heart pounding. The real terror began one stormy night in late October. Lightning flashed, illuminating the living room in stark white light. I woke to find the doll sitting in my recliner, its little head now tilted back in a mockery of laughter. I tried to pick it up, but it felt impossibly heavy, almost alive, wriggling slightly in my hands. I dropped it onto the floor. The moment it hit, the lights in the apartment flickered, then went out entirely. I stumbled toward the door to grab a flashlight, and that's when I felt it. Tiny, cold fingers brushing against my ankle. My blood ran cold. I looked down, and there it was, standing upright on the floor, its grin impossibly wide, glassy eyes reflecting the dim glow from the storm outside. I tried to move backward, but I tripped over nothing and fell. When I looked up, the doll had crawled to the middle of the room, its stitched mouth twitching as if it were breathing. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out the door, running through the rain-slicked parking lot into the nearest convenience store. I didn't care about anything but escaping. I called my parents in tears, explaining nothing except that something was wrong with the doll in my apartment. They were sympathetic, but none of them could stay with me that night. I ended up sleeping in my car, drenched and terrified. The next morning, I returned with a plan to destroy the doll. I grabbed a hammer and drove to my apartment. The moment I opened the door, the doll was sitting on my bed, as if it had been waiting. I swung the hammer down, but instead of breaking, the doll seemed to recoil from the impact, then bounce upright with no damage at all. Its grin now seemed to widen further, almost impossibly, and its eyes seemed darker, more aware. I left, shaking, and didn't go back. I called Mr. Callahan again, pleading with him to take the doll. This time he hesitated, then said softly, "I warned you, Labubu doesn't like to be abandoned. She chooses her home, and she chose yours." I didn't understand what he meant, but I was too scared to argue. I begged him to take it away. He said he would, but it might take some time. Weeks passed, and I thought I was free. I started renting a small room at my friend's house, keeping my apartment key locked away. But the sounds began again. Soft footsteps in the hallway, the faint giggle, the rustling of fabric. One night, I woke to a dull tapping on the window. My heart sank. I pulled the curtain aside, and for a brief moment I could see the doll, sitting on the windowsill, its head cocked, eyes gleaming in the moonlight. I ran out into the rain, knowing there was nothing I could do. Years later, I moved across state lines. I tried to forget about the Labubu doll, but sometimes I still catch glimpses of yellow fabric in my peripheral vision. Once at a garage sale in Ohio, I saw a small doll with oversized ears and a stitched grin on a table, staring directly at me. My hands shook. I didn't approach. I walked away quickly, and I can still feel the unease settling into my chest as if it had followed me. The worst part is knowing it's patient. It doesn't rush. It waits. It finds a way into your life, chooses a home, and lingers. It doesn't scream, it doesn't shout, it simply watches. And the moment it knows you're aware, it begins to play. The faint giggling, the scratches, the way objects shift slightly when you aren't looking. Labubu doesn't just sit. Labubu waits, and Labubu remembers. Even now, I can't go near dolls, antique shops, or even thrift stores. Every time I see a handmade doll or something with glass eyes, my stomach twists. I sometimes wonder if the doll is still out there, waiting for the right person to notice it, to choose them the way it chose me. And part of me knows that if it ever does, I'll see it again, grinning that impossible grin, watching with those glassy eyes, patient and aware of every move I make. Some nights I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear tiny footsteps pacing outside my bedroom door, faint scratches on the floorboards, a soft, high-pitched giggle just at the edge of my hearing. I tell myself it's my imagination. I try to convince myself it's nothing. But deep down I know better. I know Labubu never really leaves. It just waits. Story the end. I had never believed in haunted objects before. Ghosts, curses, possessed dolls. They all seemed like campfire stories meant to scare kids. Nothing more. But that all changed the day I found the Labubu doll. It started on a rainy afternoon. I had taken a wrong turn on my way back from work and ended up in a rundown part of town I didn't recognize. Shops were shuttered, and the streets were slick with rainwater reflecting the weak glow of broken streetlights. That's when I noticed a tiny store tucked between a boarded-up laundromat and a pawn shop. The sign read "Curiosities and Collectibles," and something about it made me pull over. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. Shelves were stacked high with faded books, ceramic figurines, and toys that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I wasn't really looking for anything, but then I saw it. A small Labubu doll perched on a high shelf, gray fur matted and dull, oversized head tilted slightly forward, and that uncanny grin stretching unnaturally across its face. I felt an odd chill when I looked at it. There was something about the eyes, black, glassy, almost wet, that made me shiver. But I was curious, not scared yet. I reached up and pulled it down. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with deep-set eyes, froze when he saw me holding it. "You don't want that," he said slowly. "It doesn't belong in a home." I laughed nervously. "It's just a doll. How bad could it be?" His gaze lingered on me a moment longer. "Some things aren't toys," he said. "They carry themselves into your life, and once they're there, they don't leave." I shrugged and handed him a $20 bill. He didn't argue, but he watched me as if he expected something terrible to happen. I brought the doll home and set it on a corner shelf in my apartment. That night, I slept fine. The first strange occurrence didn't happen until the next evening. I was watching TV when I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. The doll, which I had left upright on the shelf, was now lying on its side. I frowned and straightened it, assuming it had just fallen. But when I went to the kitchen to get water, I heard a faint giggle. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. It wasn't a child's laugh exactly. It was warped, almost wrong. I turned toward the living room, but the doll was back on its shelf, upright again, staring at me with that fixed grin. The next few days were worse. Every time I came home, the doll had moved. Sometimes it was on the coffee table, other times on the arm of the couch, or sitting on the floor, staring up at me. At night, I started hearing soft scratching noises, tiny claws scraping along the hardwood. One night, I awoke to the sound of whispered words, just barely audible, coming from the living room. I couldn't understand what was being said, but the tone was mocking, playful, yet menacing. I tried leaving it in different rooms, even packing it into a box and putting it in the closet. Nothing worked. No matter where I hid it, I would find it in the morning sitting somewhere obvious, staring at me. One night, after nearly 3 weeks of this, I woke up gasping. My bedroom door was wide open, and the doll was sitting on the floor beside my bed. Its grin looked wider than ever, and I could have sworn its tiny body was slightly hunched forward, like it was leaning toward me. I reached for it, intending to throw it into the trash, but my hand froze. The doll's eyes seemed to follow me, and for a horrifying moment I felt as if it were alive. My body was heavy, almost paralyzed, as though some invisible force held me in place. Then a whisper tickled the edge of my hearing. "Stay," I screamed, and the doll fell backward as if shoved by some unseen force. I ran out of my apartment that night and stayed at a friend's place. I didn't want to go back. The next day, I called a junk removal service and had the doll hauled away. I told myself I had finally rid myself of it. But when I returned home that evening, sitting casually on my couch, was the Labubu doll, grinning at me as though nothing had happened. I was losing my mind. I started sleeping in the living room with every light on. I barricaded doors and even tried covering it with a heavy blanket. But I kept hearing its faint footsteps, moving around, whispering, giggling. Things in the apartment began moving on their own. My keys disappeared, then reappeared in the fridge. My laptop opened by itself, playing static-filled videos of the doll sitting in different parts of the apartment. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped talking to people. I barely left my apartment. The doll's presence became oppressive, like a cloud hanging over my life. One night, I woke up to a sensation of being watched. The room was dark, but I could see its eyes reflecting in the faint light from the street. It had moved to the edge of my bed. My heart raced as I tried to speak, to demand it go away, but no words came. It just stared, tilting its head, grinning. I don't know how long I sat there paralyzed, but when I finally blinked, the doll was gone. It's been months now. I don't sleep well, and I constantly feel its presence. Sometimes I hear it whispering my name when I'm alone. I've tried moving, selling the apartment, even giving the doll away, but it always finds its way back. Every time, I find it sitting somewhere I never put it, its grin stretched impossibly wide. I write this because I don't know how much longer I can survive like this. The Labubu doll is relentless. It doesn't just haunt you. It invades your life, your mind. And no matter what I do, I know it will never let me go. Tonight, I hear it again, moving across the floor. Its tiny steps echo in the dark, getting closer. Story the end. It started with a simple curiosity. Rachel, a young woman living in a small suburban town in Ohio, was browsing an online auction site late one sleepless night when she came across a listing that made her pause. Labubu doll needs a loving home, it read, accompanied by a grainy photo of a small porcelain-faced doll with oversized glassy eyes and a faint stitched smile. Its little red dress was faded and frayed, and its tiny hands were delicate, unnaturally lifelike. Rachel was a collector of vintage dolls, but there was something about this one that unsettled her and drew her in at the same time. The seller was an elderly man named Harold, who claimed the doll had been in his family for generations. In his brief description, he wrote, "People say she has a personality. I've never seen it myself, but some claim she moves on her own or watches you when no one is around. She's harmless, I think." Rachel laughed at the disclaimer. The tone made her feel both amused and slightly unnerved, but she was intrigued enough to bid on it. By the next day, the doll was hers, delivered in a small, worn cardboard box that smelled faintly of old cedar and mothballs. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Rachel placed the Labubu doll on a high shelf in her living room, admiring its vintage charm. That night, however, she dreamed of the doll. In her dream, it was standing at the edge of her bed, its glassy eyes locked on hers, whispering something she couldn't make out. When she woke, she found herself staring at the shelf, um, half expecting to see it move, but it hadn't. She tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on exhaustion. Days passed, and Rachel began noticing subtle changes in her apartment. Small items were slightly out of place. The remote control moved from the coffee table to the edge of the couch. Her phone charger was on the kitchen counter instead of her nightstand. At first, she thought she had misplaced things herself. But then she saw the doll in the middle of her living room floor one morning, facing her door. She was certain she had left it on the shelf. Over the next week, the doll seemed to be moving more deliberately. Rachel would leave her apartment for a few hours, only to return and find it in a completely different position, sometimes facing her, sometimes perched on chairs or counters. At night, she began hearing whispers, soft, faint, almost imperceptible, but they called her name, Rachel. Rachel. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, only to find the doll still on the shelf, its eyes catching the moonlight in a way that made them seem alive. Rachel tried documenting the occurrences. She set up her phone to record the living room overnight. The next morning, she watched the footage with growing dread. For the first few hours, nothing unusual happened. But around 3 a.m., the doll turned its head slightly, a movement so small she initially thought it was her imagination. A few minutes later, it shifted its body ever so subtly, facing the camera directly. Rachel's stomach dropped. She rewound the footage again and again. There was no question the doll had moved. Determined to understand what she was dealing with, Rachel started researching the history of Labubu dolls. She discovered stories about dolls originating from certain Southeast Asian regions, known for carrying spiritual attachments. The stories were chilling. Dolls that moved, whispered, or attached themselves to their owners in ways that seemed impossible. Some accounts described owners who had been driven to fear and sleeplessness, while others spoke of dolls that could not be discarded, no matter what was done to them. Terrified but desperate for a solution, Rachel attempted to remove the doll from her home. She boxed it, took it to the nearby park, and left it in the bushes, hoping someone else might find it. The next morning, she found it back in her apartment, sitting on her couch, its eyes reflecting the first rays of dawn as if mocking her attempts. Every effort to get rid of it failed. The doll seemed to have a will of its own, persistent and relentless. Sleep became a rare commodity. Rachel heard the whispers constantly, soft and insistent, always repeating fragments of her name or indistinct words. Shadows flitted across her peripheral vision, and small objects shifted inexplicably around her apartment. The doll's presence was oppressive, a constant weight she could not shake. Even when she left the apartment, she felt as if it followed her, a shadow lingering at the edge of perception. Rachel sought help from a local paranormal expert named Jonathan. He was skeptical but agreed to investigate. Upon seeing the doll, his expression changed. He explained that some spirits, often restless or bound by unresolved circumstances, can attach themselves to objects. Labubu dolls were particularly infamous for this, he said, due to their history and the rituals sometimes performed in their creation. He advised Rachel to perform protective rituals, keep the doll in a consecrated space, and avoid direct contact as much as possible. Despite her best efforts, the doll resisted containment. It would appear in areas outside the protective circle, whispering, moving, and watching. Rachel became a prisoner in her own home, avoiding rooms and limiting her movements to minimize encounters. The whispers were louder at night, forming broken phrases that made no sense but sounded like urgent communication. She sometimes caught fleeting glimpses of figures in the dark corners, always vanishing when she tried to focus on them. Months passed. Rachel's friends noticed her withdrawal. She barely left the apartment, her social interactions dwindling. She spoke of the doll in hushed tones, describing the movements, whispers, and eerie presence. Most dismissed her accounts as stress-induced paranoia, but she knew better. She had seen it move, heard it whisper, felt it watching her every move. One night, Rachel woke to find the doll sitting on her bed, facing her. Its glassy eyes glinted in the dim light, and for the first time she heard it speak a complete sentence, clear and deliberate. "Stay with me." Her body froze, a mixture of terror and disbelief rooting her in place. She reached for it, but as soon as her fingers brushed the porcelain surface, a sharp pain shot through her hand, leaving faint red marks. The doll had marked her, a silent claim on her existence. Over time, Rachel adapted to the doll's presence. She learned to negotiate with it, speaking softly, acknowledging its demands, and giving in to its subtle manipulations. The whispers became a constant background to her life, a companion she could not avoid. She realized that the doll had not just entered her life, it had reshaped it, and no amount of reasoning, ritual, or escape could change that. Years went by. Rachel grew older, her life revolving around the presence of the Labubu doll. She never left it unattended for long, and she never underestimated its influence. The whispers never stopped, but she learned to listen, to respond in small, careful ways, understanding that acknowledgement was better than defiance. The doll had become a constant, an inseparable companion, a force beyond her control. Even now, late at night, the doll sits on its shelf, eyes catching the faint glow of the moon, whispering Rachel's name. She answers softly, cautiously, because she knows the consequences of ignoring it. The Labubu doll is patient, immortal in its persistence, and it has chosen her to live in a world where some curiosities are permanent, where some objects are more than they appear, and where some companionships are forged in fear, dread, and inevitability. Rachel sometimes wonders who the doll will claim next, who will become the next keeper of its whispers, the next observer of its patient gaze. But she knows it doesn't matter. The Labubu doll waits, watches, and whispers, eternal in its silent dominion, and she has learned to live within its shadow. Story the end. Jared had always been a skeptic when it came to anything supernatural. At 32, living in a small apartment in Chicago, he preferred tangible fears: job insecurity, rent, traffic, ghosts, curses, haunted objects, nonsense. That is, until the Labubu doll arrived. It came packaged in a plain, brown box with no return address. Inside, nestled in shredded paper, was a small cloth doll, roughly a foot tall, with a disproportionately large head and black button eyes that seemed almost too reflective. Its yarn hair was messy, tangled in a way that suggested long neglect. Alongside it was a folded note that read, "Do not anger. Watch. Protect." Jared scoffed at the warning, tossing it onto the counter. He placed the doll on his TV stand and went to bed, not thinking much of it. That night, he awoke to the faint sound of movement. At first, he assumed it was the heating system, but then he heard a soft scraping sound coming from the living room. Blinking into the dark, he saw the doll wasn't where he had left it. It had shifted slightly, now facing his bedroom door. "Must be my imagination," he muttered, rolling over. But the feeling of being watched lingered, prickling at the base of his neck. Over the next week, the disturbances escalated. Books would topple from shelves, mugs would appear in different places, and his apartment's lights occasionally flickered for no discernible reason. Jared began recording the doll with his phone to prove to himself that it was nothing, but reviewing the footage always made him uneasy. The doll never appeared in the frame exactly where he left it, and its button eyes always seemed to reflect the camera's light differently, almost like tiny pupils tracking his movements. One evening, Jared had a friend over, a coworker named Mark. While Jared went to the kitchen for a drink, Mark noticed the doll leaning slightly forward, its head tilted, staring at him. Jared? Is that new?" Mark asked. Jared shrugged. "Just a weird little doll I got online. Nothing to worry about." Mark laughed nervously, but his unease didn't dissipate. Later, while they were watching TV, the doll somehow ended up on the coffee table, sitting upright, despite no one having moved it. When Jared reached to reposition it, his hand trembled as the doll's head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging him. A chill ran down his spine, but he laughed it off, blaming the stress of work. The next nights were worse. Whispering sounds filled the apartment, low and almost indistinguishable, coming from all directions. Jared would wake to the feeling of being pressed down on his bed, as though an unseen weight bore down on him. Shadows moved unnaturally, and the doll was never where he had last left it. Once, he found it on the kitchen counter, staring at his refrigerator, which had been stocked and organized just hours earlier. Desperate for answers, Jared turned to research. The Labubu doll, he discovered, originated as a traditional Southeast Asian protective charm intended to ward off evil spirits, But there were countless accounts of the dolls becoming sentient, influencing behavior, even harming those who disrespected them. He read stories eerily similar to what he was experiencing. Subtle disturbances, escalating into frightening events, whispers that no one else could hear, and sudden disappearances of owners or pets. One night, Jared tried to sleep while keeping the doll in the bathroom, hoping it would stop the nightly disturbances. Around 3 a.m., he woke to a scraping noise outside the bedroom door. The doll was there on the floor, its button eyes glinting in the dim hallway light. Trembling, he picked it up and threw it into a cardboard box, sealing it tightly and placing it in the closet. He told himself he was done with it. By dawn, he found the doll on his nightstand. The box was open, flaps torn, the doll sitting perfectly upright, staring at him. Panic gripped him, and he tried to destroy it, setting it on fire in the sink. The fabric scorched, but refused to burn completely, curling and smoking but remaining intact. When he returned from the kitchen a few minutes later, the doll was back on the nightstand, unharmed, its black eyes gleaming. Sleep-deprived and terrified, Jared called a paranormal investigator recommended by a forum he stumbled upon. The investigator, an older woman named Evelyn, arrived with equipment to document the doll's behavior. Cameras, audio recorders, thermal sensors, everything was set up. That night, as the doll sat in the living room, the recordings captured static, faint whispering, and rapid temperature drops around the object. The investigators watched live footage, horrified, as the doll moved inches at a time on its own, leaning closer to the investigators' equipment, its button eyes seemingly reflecting light in a way that wasn't consistent with any normal object. Evelyn warned Jared that the doll was not just a harmless object, it was sentient, aware, and capable of influencing reality in subtle and frightening ways. "Do not try to destroy it," she said gravely. "It doesn't want to harm you immediately, but it will enforce its presence. Respect it. Follow its rules. That is your only option." Jared tried to comply, cautiously leaving the doll alone, placing it in different areas, and speaking softly to it as if acknowledging its awareness. For a brief period, disturbances lessened, but the whispers never stopped entirely. Shadows lingered just beyond the corner of his vision. Small objects occasionally moved overnight, and a sense of being watched was constant. Then came the day he returned home to find a note on the doll. "She waits. You watch, you belong." Jared's blood ran cold. He didn't write it. He had not touched the doll in days. The handwriting was jagged and unfamiliar, yet somehow carried an authority that he felt compelled to obey. Jared tried to reach out to Evelyn again, but she had vanished. Her contact numbers disconnected, and online traces of her work disappeared as if they had never existed. The doll remained, its presence increasingly dominant in his life. Friends stopped visiting. Work suffered as he spent more nights awake, observing the doll's subtle shifts. Food would go missing, lights would flicker, strange shadows lingered, and the whispers grew louder. Months later, neighbors reported odd sounds from his apartment. Screams, footsteps, occasional laughter that didn't match any resident. When maintenance checked, they found the apartment dark and silent, with the door unlocked. Jared was gone. The doll was perched on the dining table, upright and unscathed, staring at the doorway as if waiting for the next occupant. New tenants eventually moved in. Almost immediately, they noticed small oddities, items out of place, shadows shifting unnaturally, whispers when the apartment was empty. The doll reappeared on a shelf, its button eyes reflecting the dim light, as if it had always been there. Those who encountered it described an overwhelming feeling of unease, a nagging awareness of being watched. Stories spread through online forums among urban explorers, paranormal enthusiasts, and antique collectors. Tales of the Labubu doll grew, detailing its peculiar characteristics. It moves when unobserved, it whispers warnings and threats, it reacts to disrespect, and attempts to destroy it are futile. Some accounts claim the doll could even manipulate reality subtly, objects disappearing, time seeming to stretch or compress, shadows lingering unnaturally. Despite the fear it inspired, curiosity remained a constant. Many sought the doll, hoping to document it or prove its supernatural qualities. Few were prepared for the consequences. Whispers in darkened apartments, fleeting shadows, objects mysteriously displaced, all became part of the daily lives of those who brought the doll home. The rules were always the same: acknowledge it, respect it, do not attempt to discard it. Ignore these rules, and the doll ensured that its influence was inescapable. Even today, in Chicago and beyond, stories of the Labubu doll circulate. Individuals report small, dark-haired dolls appearing unexpectedly, on shelves, in boxes, or left at their doorsteps. Those who attempt to ignore or dispose of it face subtle but increasing disturbances. Whispers in the night, fleeting shadows, objects moving on their own. The doll watches, waits, and enforces its presence. Curiosity might bring it into your home, but once it arrives, freedom is uncertain. Jared's family continues to search, but every lead ends in dead ends or eerie coincidences. His friends occasionally receive cryptic messages through old social media accounts, pictures of the doll in unfamiliar settings with captions like, "She waits, you watch, you belong." The messages always stop abruptly, as if the sender vanished mid-sentence. The legend of the Labubu doll endures, growing with each new encounter. Its sentience, persistence, and unyielding nature make it more than just an object. It is an agent of fear, subtle control, and perhaps even reality manipulation. Those who encounter it are forever marked, living under the constant, silent observation of button eyes that never blink. For anyone who receives or discovers such a doll, the warning is clear. Respect it. Do not attempt to destroy it. Do not abandon it. Its presence is patient, insidious, and enduring. Ignore it at your peril. For once the Labubu doll is in your life, it will not leave, and the whispers will never truly stop. Story, the end. I never meant to get involved with something like that. It started out as a simple online purchase, something I thought would be harmless. I had been browsing a local classified site looking for small collectibles. My habit of collecting odd little things always got me into trouble, but I liked it. That's when I saw the Labubu doll. Its photo was low resolution, and it was perched on a wooden chair in some dimly lit room. Its eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed almost too lifelike. The description was short, almost careless. Labubu doll, rare, slight wear, pickup only. The seller's name was generic, and the price was suspiciously low, $25. Curiosity won. I sent a message asking if I could see it that evening. The reply was almost immediate. Sure, come by after 6. The house was on the outskirts of a sleepy town, one of those neighborhoods where the lawns are overgrown and every house looks slightly abandoned. I parked and walked up to the porch. The door opened before I could knock, revealing an older woman with a small, tight smile. "You're here for the doll?" she asked. "Yes," I replied, stepping inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and something faintly floral, like old perfume. The living room was cluttered with shelves stacked with figurines, knickknacks, and dozens of dolls. Some were smiling, some were cracked and chipped, but the one that caught my attention was the Labubu doll. Small, dark, with rounded eyes and a stitched mouth. "Here," she said, picking it up and handing it to me. "It's special. Be careful with it." I laughed. "Special how?" Her eyes met mine, serious, almost sad. "It watches. That's all I can say." I didn't know whether to laugh or feel uneasy. I shrugged it off and took the doll home, tucking it into a small box until I could find a place for it. That night, I placed it on a shelf in my bedroom. I tried to convince myself it was just a toy. At first, nothing happened. But then I noticed small things. A window left slightly open, a chair not quite where I remembered leaving it. And then, the first night, I woke to a soft sound, a squeak like the doll shifting its weight. My room was dark, my apartment silent, yet I felt eyes on me. My heart pounded. I turned on the lamp. The doll was on the floor. I hadn't moved it. I picked it up, told myself it was nothing, and returned to bed. I barely slept. The next day, I came home to find the doll on my living room couch. I was sure I had left it in my bedroom. Over the next few days, the movements became more pronounced. Not just small shifts, sometimes I found it in entirely different rooms, staring at me with that same stitched smile. Then the whispering began. At first, it was soft, almost inaudible. I thought I was imagining it, but I could hear my name, faintly at first, in the middle of the night. "Daniel, Daniel." I tried ignoring it. I tried locking it in a cabinet. The next morning, it was on the kitchen counter, arms folded, staring at me. I started to feel trapped. Everywhere I went in the apartment, it seemed to know where I was. Sometimes I would wake to find it inches from my face, sitting upright in bed. The air would feel colder, heavier, and sometimes I swore I could see shadows moving around it, shadows that didn't belong to anything in the room. I tried to get rid of it. I drove hours away and left it in a remote field. When I returned home, it was sitting on my living room shelf. I buried it in my backyard. It reappeared the next day in perfect condition. I burned it. The stench of charred fabric filled the apartment, but when I woke up the next morning, it was back. I began to isolate myself. Friends stopped calling. I stopped answering messages. I barely left the house, terrified of what it could do if I wasn't watching it. My dreams became nightmares. Dark corridors, endless rooms, the doll always there, staring, whispering, moving closer. One night I woke to the sound of scratching at my bedroom door. The whispers were louder now, forming words. You belong to me. You cannot escape. Labubu watches. I screamed and ran to the kitchen where the doll was sitting in the middle of the floor, its head tilted unnaturally. I grabbed a knife, but I knew instinctively it wouldn't matter. Its stitched mouth seemed to twist into a grin, broader than before, impossibly so. Sleep became impossible. My body grew weak from exhaustion. I could feel it in every room, in every shadow. Sometimes I would wake with new scratches on my arms and legs. Other times, I found small tears in my clothes as if something had pulled at me during the night. I tried to leave the apartment entirely, moving into a hotel across town. I brought the doll with me, thinking perhaps distance might help. It didn't. The whispers followed. The movement followed. The doll never stopped. It adapted to every attempt I made to evade it. Then came the calls. The woman who sold me the doll began calling, her voice calm, insistent. It belongs with you now, she said. You cannot run. Labubu chooses, and you are chosen. I couldn't escape. No matter where I went, no matter how far, it appeared, always watching, always whispering. I started to hear its voice not just in the dark, but in my waking moments, a constant hum of menace. You are mine, always, forever. Months passed. I stopped eating properly. I stopped leaving the room. The doll would sit across from me, unblinking, seemingly waiting for my next move. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, flickering with its presence. One evening, I woke to find it sitting on my chest, its tiny hands pressing into my skin, its stitched face impossibly close. I screamed. I ran into the bathroom and locked the door, but the whispers were inside, soft but insistent. You cannot hide, Labubu sees. I tried everything. Moving, burning, burying, smashing. Nothing worked. It was patient. It was relentless. It had chosen me, and I could not escape. I write this now because I cannot keep silent. If anyone reading this sees a Labubu doll, do not touch it. Do not bring it home. Because once it chooses, you are never free. I live in constant fear. Every shadow, every sound, every whisper of mine is there, watching, waiting, learning. I have learned one truth I cannot unlearn. Labubu does not just exist. Labubu claims, Labubu dominates, and it is watching me right now. Story the end.